Hello and welcome to Material Matters with Grant Gibson. This is the show where I speak to a designer, maker, artist or architect about a material or technique with which they're intrinsically linked and discover how it changed their lives and careers. Currently I find myself in the Wimbledon studio of the legendary Formula One designer John Barnard. In an extraordinary career which saw him work for the likes of McLaren and Ferrari, John dreamt up a dazzling array of innovations. In 1979, for instance, he designed the first ground effect car for IndyCar racing at Chaparral, while at Ferrari in 1987, he created the revolutionary semi-automatic gearbox with the paddle shift on the steering wheel. However, he's arguably best known for coming up with the first car to possess a carbon fibre chassis while he was at McLaren in 1980. The material ensured that the team's cars were lighter, stronger and safer. Oh, and they won a lot too, picking up 2 constructors' titles in 1984 and 85 and 3 drivers' titles from 1984 to 1986. His work effectively transformed the sport. If motor racing is an orchestra of materials, then John is the ultimate conductor. More recently, John has used the material to create furniture with designer Terence Woodgate for Establish & Sons. Meanwhile, his biography, The Perfect Car, written by Nick Skeens, was published in 2018. John, thank you very, very much for agreeing to do this. It's very kind.
My pleasure.
Can we kick off with the book?
Certainly.
Because it's a hugely weighty tome,
yes.
600 pages or so.
Yes.
How did it come about? Why now?
Well, strangely enough, it came about because the writer, Nick Skeens, was writing a book for someone else about design in Britain. Looking at all aspects of design, from clothing to furniture to whatever. And he got into the furniture side and spoke to my colleague on that side, Terence Woodgate. And Terence said, have you spoken to John Barnard? And he said, no. And, Terence said, well, he used to do all the Formula One stuff. And Nick didn't know anything about Formula One, so Nick said, I must give him a call. And then it went from there, and I spoke to Nick, and Nick said, has anybody done a book? And I said, no, I was approached a couple of times, but I felt whilst I was in the business, it was probably politically not a good thing to do, apart from spending a lot of time, which I didn't have. So I said to Nick, okay, let's think about it. And we started talking about it as an autobiography, me telling Nick everything I could remember. And then I said to Nick, well, Nick, I said that the problem is I want people to believe it. I want people to know that what's in the book is accurate. And therefore, it's got to be a biography. So you are going to have to go out there on your own, talk to people that work for me, talk to people that know me, talk to the teams, learn about Formula One. And that's what he did. And it took him a long time. I can't remember when we started the project. It was something like 2009, something like that. So, it's taken a few years for Nick to get all his thoughts, and not just his thoughts, but I think his take on me, down in the book.
Well, I was going to ask you about that. It is an excellent read, by the way. And it is very honest. You see, the good, the bad, the beautiful, the less beautiful. And this was obviously very important.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's the point. It's you read these autobiographies, and it's people just saying everything that's good, really. And I thought, I know. I admit to having a bit of a reputation as being quite tough, quite a hard taskmaster. But and I can't deny that. That's the way it is. I got this. It was Tyler Alexander, I think, back in my days at McLaren early on. I think he came up with the nickname Prince of Darkness.
Yes, which is a chapter to one of the
books. because I tended to my natural, let's say, modus operandi is to look for the problems. If my feeling is I can't just walk around saying, "Oh, that's really good, well done, nice job, brilliant." Yeah, you have to do that sometimes. But if you want to be better, then you've got to look for the problems. What's wrong with it, And so that's what I ended up doing. And, I used to get a reputation for basically, if I went out in the workshop, which I did a lot, I was often in the workshop wandering about looking for stuff. And, they said, well, you won't, if you've made a mistake somewhere, you won't get away with it, basically.
No, you seem to have this eye for problems seems to come through in the book.
Yeah. So that was it. And, of course, and then there's the whole business of delegation. And delegation is a very difficult thing to get right. And so I suppose my big thing was the design and technical side. To me, I got a lot more pleasure out of that side than actually going racing. I got pleasure when we won, obviously, and winning championships and so on. That's what you're there for. But at the end of the day, it was the technical side that really got, into me. And so walking around the drawing office, talking to the designers that were working for me wherever I might be, that fascinated me because I would give them a project, I'd give them a part to do or something, and I'd talk it through with them initially, and then kind of let them go a little bit on their own, and then I'd come back and see how they were getting on, and if they deviated down some different route to the one I thought they should be going down, that's okay, but they have to answer my questions, with an answer that I can believe. So it's no good going off in another direction. I say, well, okay, but you've done this. Now, what are you going to do if this happens, if that happens? How are you going to make that? And I would ask them all these questions. And if they couldn't answer those questions in a way that convinced me that was a possibility, going off in this other direction, I would say, well, I'm sorry, you're going to have to go and do it the way I want, because I've already asked myself those questions and I've got an answer. I mean, even go back to the carbon monocoque, the first one. In the back of my head was, it was so new. I had nothing to base it on, nothing. No one had done anything like it. What do I do if we've got a problem, if it's fundamentally a problem? Because at the time when it became public that I was doing this all-carbon monocoque, there were people in the pit lane, people, quite high-profile people, designers, technical people, who were saying, oh, it'll be a disaster. If it hits something, it'll explode in a cloud of black dust.
Well, I think Gordon Murray is quoted in the book saying it would dissolve into a cloud of black dust. Yeah,
absolutely. And to be fair, Gordon had already used one or two carbon fibre panels on his aluminium monocoques. He'd kind of integrated them, just simple flat panels that he'd glued and riveted in place.
And Graham Hill had
well, Graham Hill's embassy
quite disastrously with it.
Very disastrously. I mean, that's a lot. There's a lot of issues like that. I mean, they had whoever was designing for Graham. Graham had this embassy team that he'd set up himself, and they were building their own car. And in the rear, I think it was the rear wing mounting end plate or something, and they'd started using strips of I guess unidirectional carbon fibre to strengthen these wing plates. I don't know what they did exactly. I have no idea how it was made, but I believe one of them broke and caused a bad accident. So there was that kind of thing. It's the same with when I went to titanium for all the uprights and so on the car. The uprights are part of the suspension that holds all the wheel and the wheel hub and brake disc and everything. I went to titanium for that. Now, Lotus had, a few years before that, had already made suspension arms and so on from titanium fabrication. Titanium fabrication being using thin gauge titanium sheet, crafted and folded by the skilled fabricators, and then it has to be welded, and it's the welding that is the problem, because you cannot let the titanium weld oxidize. You must remove all oxygen from where you're welding, And I don't think, and Lotus were trying to weld it using a hood on their welding torch to flood the area that they were welding with like an argon and inert gas, in order to keep the weld clean, but it wasn't good enough. And so a lot of that suspension all started cracking and so on. I can't remember exactly, but I believe there was Clay Regazzoni's accident, which was that in the Shadow, I believe? I can't remember now. But Clay Regazzoni had a very bad accident, put him in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. And I think that was somebody had made a titanium brake pedal or something, which failed. I believe that's true. So, there were all these things in the background, and then me turning around one day and saying, right, we're going from 4130 heat-treated steel, we're going to go to titanium, because I wanted to save the weight. And so everybody's first reaction, everybody's goes, oh my God, Lotus did that and it all cracked and,
Well, I mean, it's an interesting thing because, coming back to carbon fibre briefly, the book kicks off in very dramatic fashion in Monza in 1981.
Yes.
With John Watson at the wheel, having this very dramatic crash.
Yes.
And lo and behold, he gets out and he's fine.
Yeah.
And he put that down very much to your carbon fibre chassis.
That was a turning point, really, in the carbon fibre monocoque. This is the first season this is 1981, the first season we're racing this all-carbon monocoque. And there are still lots of people in the pit lane all, umming and ahhing about it. John had this major accident at Monza, and he admits it's his fault. He ran over the curb and lost it. Quite high speed. I can't remember. It was probably 140, 150 mile an hour corner, something like that. And went across the track, clouted the barrier. It snapped the engine off the back of the monocoque, and the gearbox broke in half, and there was like a flash oil fire from the gearbox, and it was really terrible looking on TV. And John stepped out, and the monocoque itself was perfectly intact. All the driver's area and everything else was perfectly intact. The engine had been ripped off the back of the monocoque without really damaging anything on the monocoque. And that accident, basically everybody turned around and looked at each other and said, well, I guess the carbon monocoque's okay. I guess it's pretty safe.
Yeah.
And that really was a fundamental turning point.
Because, as you've alluded to, you were very much going against the consensus from the media, from the paddock. Yeah. That obviously didn't bother you. You complete...
Well, I think that's another issue, which is interesting, because if you want to do something different, if you're going down a different route, you have to be completely committed, and you have to ask yourself the questions first. What if this? What if that? And you have to have an answer in your head. But from there on, you are going to find lots and lots of naysayers, and you've got to be prepared to either ignore them completely or confront them. And the same thing happened with the paddle shift gearbox.
Which was 87 for Ferrari, right?
Yeah, 88, 87, 88, 89. 89 was the first year we raced it at Ferrari. But that was the same deal. I had to be absolutely committed to doing it that way. And the same with the carbon monocoque. I had to be completely committed, and because if I'm not committed, the drivers aren't going to get in the car. The thing you got to, when you're dealing with racing cars and racing drivers, is that you have to convince them that they are stepping into something which is, number one, quick, fast, potentially the fastest car on the track. Number two, it's well built and isn't going to fail. And they need to believe in that.
Well, there was an interesting quote, I thought, towards the back end of the book and towards the kind of the tail end of your F1 career, where you I think it was for Arrows, you were talking to Damon Hill, and he's quoted in the book as saying the first thing you said to him was, "I'll make the car safe," which I thought was quite a fascinating thing to say to a racing driver.
I guess Nick talked to Damon. I don't remember that. I do remember, I suppose it depends on the driver. It depends at what point he is in his career. Because I do know that some drivers, if you gave them a list and said, what do you want at the top of the list? Do you want it to be super quick, but, a little bit fragile? Do you want it to be sort of comfortably quick and, reasonably? And do you want it to be safe and then quick? They go straight to the top of the list.
Yeah.
I want it quick. I don't care. There are a lot. I guess these days, of course, the whole scene has changed. You've got so many regulations about safety, about testing the chassis and so on, that it doesn't even need to be said now. But in going back, there was a lot of stuff done that was, shall we say, quite rule of thumb.
Well, it's an interesting one because I'm keen to talk a bit more in detail about carbon fibre, but just before we get into that, one of the threads that runs through the book, one of the other threads that runs through the book is frankly, is death. I mean, there's an awful lot of dying going on. I mean, there's an utterly horrendous story of Helmut Koenig, the German driver, I think, who was decapitated, and there's an image of his head bouncing around the track with the cars continuing to race.
Horrendous.
That was in the US, in US Grand Prix 74, I believe. And it seemed to me there are two deaths, accidents that affected you particularly, John, if you don't mind talking about this.
Sure.
Joe Bonnier, who died
Joe Bonnier, yes. That was when I was at Lola's way back in the 70s.
72, I think, at Le Mans.
Working at Lola's, where I started in racing, and that was 68, I think it was, when I first started there. We used to, just to explain, Lola's were a racing car company who built racing cars to sell. So it was an interesting, going back, talking about design, working for Lola, you had a slightly different list of parameters, and cost of components was fairly near the top of that list of parameters. I mean, you had to make it quick and, easy to build and easy to assemble and all the rest of it, because these cars had to be sold for a profit. But whereas in Formula One, that list changes, cost goes quite a long way down the list, and performance and so on is right at the top. So there's a kind of a different design parameters. But I do remember in those days we worked. How many of us were there in the drawing office then? I think 3-4 people maybe. And with Eric Broadley, the boss, who Eric was the sort of chief designer in as much as he would define what he wanted and then come out to the drawing office and give it to one of us to do. I got heavily involved in what were the 2-litre and 3-litre sports cars. And Joe's... and in those days, we didn't have... We didn't really know that much about aerodynamics, to be frank. We didn't have the facilities of proper wind tunnels, rolling roads. We just didn't have it. It wasn't there. It hadn't been done then. So a lot of that was done by, again, your own thoughts, your own eye. And basically Joe's 3-litre at Le Mans took off and ended up in the trees, some sort of 20 feet up in the trees, just flew, and that brought home to me what we were really dealing with. I mean, you kind of, you're doing what you've always wanted to do. I want to work for a racing car company. I wanted to, I know I'm not a driver. I want to design racing cars. Fantastic. We got the chance. Eric gave us the chance. But you're ploughing on and it's great. And, you go to a circuit, you go testing with somebody and, it's fantastic. I mean, this is it. And then one day, I wasn't there, but I mean, the news comes back, Joe's been killed at Le Mans. And you just go, oh, what? I'm involved in that. I've drawn bits on that car. And that really brings it home to you. And that's the first one that was brought home to me. Although I wasn't that close to it, but, I was involved.
Yeah. I mean, the other kind of death that seems to have had a profound effect, I mean, not just on you, but on the whole sport, I guess, was, I mean, it's over 20 years later, that horrendous weekend at Imola, where Roland Ratzenberger died in testing or practice.
Yes.
And then obviously Ayrton Senna died.
Yes.
And what kind of effect did that have on you?
The whole paddock just stopped, basically. It's like... I hate to say it, Roland Ratzenberger was killed. That was bad enough. That was terrible. But Roland Ratzenberger was, he was there in a car which wasn't going to win. I mean, that was just the basic, Roland Ratzenberger was he was lucky to get into Formula One. He got in, he was driving as you do when you start, let's put it this way, very much not a front-running car. So when he died, it was very bad, bad news. But when Ayrton was killed, that was just like, it just stopped the world in racing. I mean, he was such a name and such a talent. And if he can be killed, then, we've got to do something because he's too good. He's just... You have to say it wasn't his fault, right? It couldn't be. He was too good. And so it caused huge, huge, huge waves. And in fact, it was the only time I can remember in Formula One where we literally changed the rules from one race to the next.
Right.
We just the diffusers were... Because... It was all about downforce. It was all about running the car close to the ground and getting as much as we could from the underside of the car. We were limited then because the cars had been made to have flat bottoms, and running them near the ground was a way of getting downforce back from the underbodies that we were running in the early 80s. So that was, and running them low gave all sorts of problems. Tyre pressures for one. I mean, if you ended up, for whatever reason, the cars were running slowly on a lap or two, tyre pressures would go down, and when they started racing again, you might see the cars start hitting the ground because you've lost pressure in the tyres, and the car's running lower. I mean, they were so critical on that ride height, but we've never really been told what the true reason is why Ayrton's car went off the track. There are lots of theories, broken steering columns, which had been, let's say, modified in the morning, and so on. But who knows? I don't know. I'm not speculating on what caused it. I just know that after that, we had to change things. We changed the aerodynamics. We cut diffusers. We put holes in the airbox to try and reduce the engine power a little bit at high speed. Just whatever could be done literally in a week was done. And so that's the reaction. And then from then on, the whole safety aspect in Formula One changed from the moment Senna was killed. And new regulations were looked at for, implementation as soon as possible. Just the whole focus of safety in Formula One changed.
Can we talk about carbon fibre, which, this podcast is ostensibly about materials.
Yes.
And this is the material with which you're kind of really linked.
Yeah.
It was unearthed in 1958 by Roger Bacon at the Union Carbide Corporation.
Yeah.
Was refined by a team of Brits, I believe, a
Yes.
British aircraft establishment, Bill
Yes.
Watt, Bill Johnson and Leslie Phillips in 1963.
That was at Farnborough, yeah.
Yeah, in Farnborough. What are its properties, John?
Well, fundamentally, its properties are that it's strong, it's stiff, and it's very light. And as a designer, most times that's what you're looking for. Most times.
But there are two distinct types, I believe I'm right in saying, CF cloth and UD tape?
Well, yes. I mean, it's fundamentally, it's the same carbon. It's just that carbon is made in in very fine, long strands. These strands are bundled together into what they call tows. And just, a tow might have 5,000 strands of carbon in it, for example. But a tow is still only, like if you look at a standard tow, it's probably, I don't know, a millimetre or something in diameter, that kind of size, So you can imagine how fine these fibres are. With unidirectional, that, to be honest, that was the first carbon that came about. And the first monocoque I did was nearly all unidirectional, which is partly why it didn't have three-dimensional shapes. It was all effectively flat facets around the monocoque because it was unidirectional. And with unidirectional, the fibres are all laid in line. The carbon fibres are all laid in line, and then they are impregnated with a resin. They are laid in a resin matrix, and usually that resin is an epoxy resin, which is cured under temperature and pressure. So you've then got these long fibres contained in this resin, and that is your effectively your cured carbon fibre matrix, if you like. Then they were able to weave it into a cloth. So you've now taken these long tows and you're weaving it into a cloth, literally like you would, any sort of fairly coarse cloth that you can imagine. That's what they're doing with the carbon fibres. So you've got unidirectional and you've got cloth.
And how is it different to work with them? I mean, chassis would have been made by aluminium before that.
Yeah.
So working with them how different was it?
Well, it was a very different design process because when you're dealing with aluminium, you're buying aluminium. Let's talk about a monocoque, which is effectively aluminium sheet folded, glued and riveted together. You buy that sheet from suppliers in certain thicknesses. And those thicknesses are very carefully controlled, down to thousandths of an inch. So when you design, you pretty much know where a face is, if you like. How can I explain this? You're going to attach something to this monocoque. Let's say you're going to attach a suspension pickup point. I know when I draw that, I know where that face is on the monocoque, and I know if I glue and rivet my wishbone pickup to it, I know where it's going to be. I can do the same on the inside. I can design something on the inside face too, because I know where that's going to be as well. When you're dealing with carbon fibre, you have to mould it. So you have to make a mould which you lay this uncured carbon fibre on, and that could be unidirectional, it could be cloth. But you lay it on there in a number of layers to build up the thickness you want for the whatever purpose it's doing. You have to work out the thicknesses to carry the loads that you want to carry in that particular area. And then it is covered with effectively, in very simple terms, it's covered with a plastic bag. You draw a vacuum in that bag, and then you put it in an autoclave and you apply pressure to it. So you consolidate.
So an autoclave is an oven.
Is effectively a big oven
pressure.
With pressure inside. Yeah. So you heat up this resin, which is kind of sticky in its natural form. You put this bag, you pull the pressure on the carbon onto the mould tool. You heat it up. After a certain heat cycle, the resin, as I say, mostly epoxy resin, sets into a solid form. What you've then got is carbon fibre, which on one side only is the shape and smoothness of the mould tool. The other side is where you had your what we call a vacuum bag, which is the plastic sheet I was talking about with various bleed things underneath it. You've effectively got an unmoulded side. So now I've got something which I know where the moulded side is going to be, but I don't know where the unmoulded side is going to be. And I'm talking within, within fractions of a millimetre, let's say, or in many cases, if it's a big, thick layup of carbon, within millimetres. So you have to kind of design with that parameter. The first monocoque I did was moulded on the inside. I made this huge aluminium mould tool in sections. We wrapped the tape, the unidirectional tape, around this tool, added the honeycomb sandwich in there, laid more carbon composite tape over the honeycomb, and then cured the whole thing on the mould tool. So now I have to say, when the first monocoque arrived, after having been laid up and cured.
It was made in the States,
right? It was made at Hercules. Yeah, they made the first ones. And when the first one arrived, the outside of it was not the prettiest sight. I mean, it was
wrinkly.
Quite wrinkly. It was a bit wrinkly. It was a bit, it was a bit uneven and so on. And you think, oh my God, that how am I going to fix anything to that? But I designed all my fixings, like suspension fixings and so on the inside face, which was the moulded face. So that process of moulded, unmoulded is very different to designing with metal. And then you've got the aspect of load direction, because if you take for example, if you take a strip of unidirectional carbon fibre that's been cured, so you've now got this stiff. Think of it. I don't know. Think of a ruler. Say 30 centimetres long, 2 inches wide. This is all unidirectional fibres. It's cured. It's stiff. I pick it up. I try and bend it, the natural way you would pick up the ends of a ruler and bend it, and it's really stiff and it's really light. I now try and bend it in the other direction across the ruler. So I'm now holding the sides of this ruler and bending it, and it'll go snap.
Right.
Because all that's holding it together in that direction is the glue, the epoxy. So when you're designing something, you've got to look at all the load paths. You've got to know what kind of loads are going in, what the load path is, which means that you end up putting all these layers of unidirectional at different angles, all taking a piece of a load that's going in. So it's a complicated process. I just remember the first monocoque I had to kind of educate myself, or at least I was fortunate to have a guy called Arthur Webb, who worked for British Aerospace and was really...
Who seemed to be working for you in his spare time. That's
that's
true?
How it started. Yeah, he was interested, and he was been right in at the beginning of carbon composite.
Well, it's an interesting thing because, even after you revolutionised the material's use, teams, according to the book, were still using it incorrectly. One of the more shocking moments was the death of Gilles Villeneuve in a crash in 1982. And there's an implication in the book that Ferrari were not using carbon fibre correctly.
Well, I don't know what's said in the book. There was certainly an element, in my opinion, there was an element of incorrect design in that car, because from what we're told, and what I understood at the time, was that Gilles was in his racing seat, which was strapped to a part of the monocoque behind him, what we would call the seat back, and it literally pulled the seat back completely out of the monocoque, with Gilles still strapped to it, still strapped to his seat, and just the impact on the car was so big, it just took his weight and tore all that seat back out of the car. That's as I understand it. To me, that's an error in design. I can't say how they manufactured the carbon monocoques, but I do know that when we started, when I started at Ferrari in 86, 87, and we created our own facility just outside Guildford, where we made the monocoques. I did not want Ferrari to make the monocoques because one thing about carbon composites, you have to know that all the processes are being followed to the exact letter, because you have to keep it clean. So when we created this facility for Ferrari in 86, 87, we had what we call a clean room, which was where all the atmosphere is controlled. It's totally dust-free. Everybody that worked in there wears overalls, gloves, hats, overshoes, and so on. I mean, it really was done to aerospace standards. And, I know that at that time, people were using carbon a bit like they used fiberglass. It was all, some of it was even wet layup, and they would get the dry carbon cloth and just, impregnate it with a brush. Maybe they were a bit better than that, but there was the idea of cleanliness, the idea of the glue joints are the big thing as well. If you don't do the glue joints correctly with the correct cleaning, the correct preparation, you just forget it. It's just not going to work. So that whole level of expertise was definitely not there in 86, 87. Now, the Villeneuve accident you're talking about is early 80s, I believe. So at what level they were then, I hate to think. But I suspect carbon fibre was being used not a lot different to fiberglass, in that kind of methodology.
I mean, you're very intriguing because, as you've alluded to before, you don't seem to be that fussed by the races themselves or going to the race. It doesn't seem to be about the glamour. I mean, you've obviously made some money, but I don't sense that money is your motivating factor. So what is the appeal, or was the appeal?
Well, winning is good. Winning is nice. I mean, I suppose when I first got in Formula One, I moved from Lola's to what was then called Team McLaren. And my first job there was to come in and work on the M23 car. But I wasn't involved at the circuit. I was in the drawing office. I was down in the workshop in the drawing office. That was it. As I said before, the technical aspect was really what fascinated me. But of course, racing depends on sponsorship. Sponsorship comes if you win. So winning is essential to be able to make things. So as I went through, I went Team McLaren, and then I moved to California, where I worked for Vel Spinelli Jones' team, still making aluminium monocoque cars. And then I came back to do the Chaparral, another aluminium monocoque car, but a ground effect car that became very successful and effectively set the trend at Indianapolis for what we call ground effect cars.
Can we very quickly just explain what ground effect is?
Ground effect is when the underside of the car has a shape to it, and as the car moves through the air over the road, the air underneath the car is a low pressure is created under the car by the shape of that underside of the car. That low pressure acts over a big area and produces huge downforce on the car. Downforce means more grip from the tyres, means you go around the corners a lot faster. So that was the step there. And then I went, having done the Chaparral and, let's say, within the business, getting a name for myself, because the Chaparral was totally new, ground up.
The 2K.
Everything new. I then met Ron Dennis, who I talked to, and he wanted to do Formula One. And he
was running a team called Project 4 at the time.
Project 4 at the time. Project 4 were running Formula 2 cars, Formula 3 cars, and they were building the BMW Pro car as a kind of a subcontract BMW deal, if you like. But Formula 2 and Formula 3 cars they were running were custom, what we call custom cars. I think they were March. They bought these cars from March, who were another company like Lola Cars making cars for sale. So I talked to Ron, and he said, "Okay," he said, "you've got a year to design this car while I go out and do the deals to so that we can go from there to create the team, if you like." And I thought, wow, I've got this time, which you don't often get in racing, to do something. I've just done the Chaparral. I need to do something. I need to take another step. People are kind of looking at me now thinking, oh, he's just done that Chaparral, which was all a whole new direction. What's he going to do now? At least that was the way I saw it. Probably most people didn't even know who the hell I was. But I thought, no, I've got to use this time. I've got to make a step. And in those days, we were under ground effect. The underside of the car was super important. The more of the underside of the car you could make into what I call a ground effect shape, the better the better aerodynamics you were going to get from your car. So I thought to myself, I need a very narrow monocoque. Now, a narrow monocoque means I'm going to lose rigidity. I'm going to lose torsional rigidity, which is important in the handling of the car. And so I then I got invited to go to British Aerospace at Weybridge, where they were doing carbon fibre. They were doing the big engine cowling for the RB211 engine in carbon. So I went there and had a look at it, and I then looked at the properties of it and thought, well, this has to be the right material. It's light, it's strong, it's stiff, and I can make it what shape I want within reason. And that has to be.
But it's step change, isn't it? That seems to interest you. It's not refining an existing car.
Yeah,
particularly.
Correct. I mean, I'd just come from. I strangely enough, having done the step change at Project 4, which we then joined forces with Team McLaren and became McLaren International, having done the carbon monocoque, in fact, at McLaren, I then did each year for about, well, to be honest, for the first 3 years, it was more or less a revision on the same monocoque. And then the further 3 years, it was a slight change to the monocoque, but the same principles. So almost for 6 years, the basic way the monocoque was built and so on in carbon, I retained. So I kind of did the step change, then I did the evolution bit. And after about 6 years, I guess I was getting fed up. This is getting quite boring. Not only that, but we were winning.
I know. Well, it's a fascinating thing because you had this season where you trounced everybody. I think you got 147 points in Ferrari and half, and Ferrari got 57, came second.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that you then you kind of went into what felt like almost like a bit of a depression about it.
Well, you're not far off. It wasn't depression. It was a case of you're talking about the 1984 season, which was super successful. And then by the middle of the season, you've won the championship. Pretty much won both. You won the drivers and the constructors. So what am I going to do for next year? I've now got to be thinking about 1985 as the chief designer, technical director. So I've got to think, what am I going to do about that? And then they bring in this rule change, or a number of rule changes, all designed to hurt the aerodynamics, because we were definitely ahead on aerodynamic development to people like Ferrari. And Ferrari, with all their political clout, got things changed. They were constantly trying to knock back the aero side because they knew that lots of the British teams were much better at that side than they were. And they were really based on engines. They were really an engine company. Enzo Ferrari was fundamentally an engine. His interest was in the engine. But then he knew after that period, sort of the 80s, that he had to up their game. So I'd been, 6 years or so at McLaren International working with Ron, and then I got these calls from Ferrari, and it's kind of, you think, yeah, if you're in racing, if you're in Formula One, you really need to work for Ferrari at least once.
Well, you did more than once.
Yeah, I did it twice.
What I'm keen to do is we'll maybe get onto Ferrari, but I'm very keen to just unpick a little bit about your background, if I may. Because you were born in 1946 in Edgware. Your parents weren't involved in racing, but they were engineers.
Yes, correct.
Because I think they worked for the Glacier Metal Company.
Yeah, well, my mother worked there during the war. My father worked there for, I don't know, 25 years or something. So he retired
your mother,
from there.
Rose Ellen, was in charge of the grinding.
I know. So I understand. She ran the grinding shop there during that period. I suppose during the wartime when lots of women did these things, with about, I don't know, a number of blokes underneath her. So she was quite a tough character.
Yeah, obviously. And you even had a forge in your house.
Oh, well, we did anything, basically, anything we needed to do. I mean, that's, I suppose, my interest in cars came about when I was a youngster, very young. But then it transpired, and by the time I got to sort of 16, 17, I was into road cars, not just into road cars, I was making things on road cars and all sorts of various things we were doing. So we were making lots of stuff at home. Taught myself to weld, gas weld, spraying and all that kind of thing. Did it all at home, just made, I mean, you wanted to go spraying. We made ourselves a compressor and, not a compressor. We got a compressor, got a tank, got a spray gun, put it all together, It's the same with the forge. I mean, we had a project where we needed to come up with some heavy metal for putting a tow bar on one of our cars. And in those days, you didn't go down the road and just buy a tow bar. You had to kind of come up with how you're going to fix this thing on the car. So you make it.
What was it about cars that appealed?
Gosh, that's a good question. I don't know, because my father, I just remember the first, I remember going back to his Morris 10. I think we were changing. He had to put a new clutch in it, and I was about 9 or 10. And I got involved. I was watching him, I suppose, more than anything, but watching him do this job. And I suppose we were always hands-on. There were lots of things we did that we were hands-on, always making something. I mean, I was a model maker when I was a kid, aeroplanes and all sorts. And that hands-on then got transferred to doing things with cars, and then having done things with cars, road cars for myself and so on, then you get to a point, well, what can I do? Can I work in this business? And then you start buying what was then a black and white auto sport. And you start reading the magazines, and slowly you're dragging in all this information about racing, and then one day you think, maybe I ought to get into racing.
I mean, I was intrigued. You even built a speedboat at your
yes, that's right. If it was 15 then, I think, and I built this plywood, marine ply, proper speedboat with steering wheel and seats and everything. My parents had we had a boat on the Thames with a large outboard motor on it, 40 horsepower, large for those days, a 40 horsepower Evinrude. And I thought, if I build a speedboat, I can clamp that on the back, and it might be good fun. It was. Built that. Just always making stuff.
I mean, I was intrigued. You didn't get into grammar school. And there's a quote where you describe yourself as an uneducated blacksmith with oily hands.
I think that's a bit stretching it, but I mean, I did go to college. I went to Tech College.
In Watford.
Yes, eventually, yes. I mean, I started off at Acton Tech for 2 years full time, and then did a sandwich course at Watford Tech. And that was a very good, I think it was a very good education, because we did covered all sorts of areas in the mechanical engineering side, structures and all sorts of stuff. Very useful. I mean, lots of the formula that we did we derived from first principles. So I can still remember lots of those formulas. I can still use them. And the thing was that, it was a very, because we weren't using computers, we were using slide rules. You had to understand the loads. You had to imagine the loads in a structure. And I think that helped me a lot later on, because I know that, even when I was employing 20 people in the drawing office, and I got 3 or 4 guys on CAD with FE and all the rest of it, quite often I could go and look at it and I'd think to myself, I don't see that load like that. Just have another look at that. See what parameters you're putting into your program, because I don't think that's correct.
And while they were using CAD, you were still working with a pencil? Or?
Oh yeah, still on the drawing board designing stuff. Yeah, but I mean, at the same time, also calculating stuff, doing calculations, not to the level of a finite element program, but doing calculations enough that would tell me what size, what shape, would most times put me right in the money, let's put it that way.
Because there's a really interesting relationship, I think, in your career, it seems to me, where there's a relationship between gut instinct, or maybe what craftspeople call tacit knowledge, and data. What's the relationship between, because it seems that you have a sense of what materials will do and what they can withstand.
Yeah, well, I think that's coming from the days when I was building lots of stuff, and not just, they went through a period, where I could use machines and that kind of thing. And when you get down and handle all of this stuff, you begin to understand what you need to do a job, what size, what shape, and so on. One of the things, even many years later, when I got our own design offices and so on, certainly after I took over the facility that we built for Ferrari, and I took it over and renamed it B3 Technologies, I used to, when we had that facility, we had our own composite shop, we had our own machine shop, test shop, design office, and so on. So it was a pretty much all-encompassing little unit. It was about 40 people. If I got a new designer in the drawing office, or a young guy in, I tried to put them in the composite section for a couple of weeks, actually making stuff in composites, actually laying up carbon fibre in moulds, bagging it, curing it, so that they could understand what you can do with it. Because the thing you can't do with carbon is sit down, draw a piece in metal, which is, let's say, a lump of metal, and I'm going to machine this, and I'm going to machine that, and I'm going to leave a bit sticking up there, drill a hole in it, bolt something to it. I can't do that with composites. It doesn't work. If you try and do that with composites, you're either going to have a failure, or you're going to end up with something which has got 10 times more composites in it than it should have. So sending them to get that hands-on experience, I felt, was really essential. And I know lots of them have said to me, I learnt a lot when I did that bit of time in the composites. And I see stuff now even that people are designing in composites, and I think to myself, you've just sat at a computer, you've sat at a CAD terminal, taken a block, chewed it out and made it composite. And I can tell that it's not been thought about as a composite component.
There's a lovely quote from Nick in the book which says, John's cars are not only expressions of his deep understanding of mechanics and his instincts for aerodynamics, they're expressions of a personality trait. So my question is, how does that personality trait express itself?
I am described by a number of people, including people in my family, as a perfectionist, sometimes in a derogatory tone. I am known as having an eye for detail. Even my builder who has worked on projects for me for 35 years, he will. I know if I use him now, kind of in almost an advisory capacity. He's nearly retired, and when he employs somebody to do a job, he says to them, "I've got to tell you, this guy will pick up the detail like no one you've ever seen." So that's me. That's the way I am, that I try, and that I hope comes through in the design, certainly in the racing cars, because one of the other things I started, and I'm going back now to the chaparral, but that only involved myself, one other guy, and a part-time guy in the drawing office. That we drew the whole thing between us. After that, starting at joining forces with Team McLaren and going in there was when I actually created a different environment in a Formula One team. I laid down the rules technically, and the rules were you don't make anything without a drawing, and every drawing's got to come from the drawing office. Up to that time, lots of little bits and pieces on the cars would have been made by the mechanics.
Wow.
Even to the point where, I don't know, you take an oil cooler bracket on one car, the mechanics have made it on that car, the mechanics looking after that car have made that bracket. The mechanics on the next car have made their own bracket for that oil cooler. Those two are not interchangeable. That's where it was at. I came along and laid down these rules, which upset quite a lot of mechanics, because lots of the mechanics, especially being Kiwis, were very much...
This was at McLaren.
This was at the first time at McLaren. We're talking 1980, 81.
Yeah.
They would have been used to just going down the bottom of the garden and making something, and that was how they operated. So I came along with this system, and that really put the cat among the pigeons.
I mean, we're talking about culture change, because we left your kind of career arc, as it were, in about 1986 when you joined Ferrari, and you cut this remarkable deal where you didn't go to Italy to work there at the home of the most famous marque in motorsport, in motoring. You stayed in Guildford.
Correct.
How on earth did you swing that?
Well, they were phoning. I was at McLaren, working away at Team McLaren, and not Team McLaren, working away at McLaren International as it was then. And they started contacting me, and they started offering me, pretty generous salaries, etc. And I just said, look, it's fine, thank you very much, but, I am not going to work in Italy. I had a young family. I had quite a nice house just outside Woking. And, I wasn't going to uproot that lot and go to Italy. So I kept saying, no, I'm sorry, I'm not going to Italy, not going to Italy. And then they came back and they said, what about if you could open an office in UK? Now, I think what was in their mind was an office with like 3 or 4 drawing boards or something, and and just me sitting there penciling all this. And I said, well, that's fine. I said, but look, you can't design and you cannot bring in new things without the ability, without direct contact with the manufacturing side. So I'm going to have to create a facility which gives me metal fabrication, it gives me carbon composite capability, it gives me design capability, and so in effect that's how it went. And they came back and said, oh, okay then, So then I started to pull in some of the people that had worked for me that I knew, etc. And I pulled in a German guy, Peter Reinhardt, who went out there and found us a brand new high-tech building that hadn't been finished, so we could create the clean rooms, we could install a big autoclave, install a machine shop. We could get it the way we wanted it. And that's what happened. And so they were the ones. I didn't say to them, well, I'm only going to do it. I kept saying, I'm sorry, I'm not going to Italy.
Yeah.
I don't want to go and live in Italy. and I would have stayed where I was.
I mean, it's during this period you came up with the semi-automatic gearbox, which we've kind of talked about. But it seems to me, as your story goes on throughout Formula One, that things, I don't know, they seem to get harder and harder, more political, possibly.
Well, that, I'm afraid, is what happens when you join a team like Ferrari. The politics there are
because they built a secret car behind your
they started, right? They built a wind tunnel model, let's put it that way.
Right.
Never got as far as a car, but it was a wind tunnel model. Yeah, I mean, the whole Ferrari atmosphere is quite political, which was another reason why staying in UK was at least some respite from it, not completely, because you still got the Italian press and all sorts going on. So it was one of those situations where, as soon as they said, "Well, have your own facility in UK," it kind of opened up another option for me. And I'm now thinking, well, they've got their own engine department. I was theoretically over that engine department as technical director. It wasn't that simple. I mean, the politics of that is something else. But but so then politics come into the scene. At McLaren, I was pretty much King Kong in terms of technical side. Ron was looking after all the finance and all the other commercial side, etc. And as he does, doing an excellent job. I was looking after the technical side, and that was it. It was, there was Frank Williams, Patrick Head, Ron Dennis, and me. That was kind of the setup. And that all worked, but not easy. I mean, every partnership is there's always a problem somewhere. It's never easy. But then along come Ferrari, and there's this Ferrari thing. There's more money. There's just the Ferrari. I mean, the prancing horse is the prancing horse.
What was Enzo like?
Enzo, I couldn't. He spoke Italian. I didn't speak Italian, so it all went through. And another guy called Marco Piccinini. But Enzo knew that he needed to get the British aerodynamics capability, and he'd been, we just had 3 successful years at McLaren with my cars, and he says this is the guy we need, because we can't do it all with the engine side. So he brought me in. I think he was one of those guys who he didn't mind pitting people against each other to see who was going to come out on top. And I think that's how he viewed it. He thought, well, it's fine. We'll let them build their facility over there, see what comes out of it. And this whole thing was going on. I was doing this new car in England and penciling it, drawing it in England. I got some drawing office there. I got all these facilities for making the monocoque, because I wasn't going to let them make the monocoque there. I didn't have the belief that they could have the standards required to guarantee, a good composite components.
Which is a fascinating indictment of the team at that stage.
Well, I think that wasn't just them. I think that was general. I mean, as I say, right. we came along.
McLaren were that far ahead.
Well, actually, this was after McLaren. This is as I left McLaren, and we're now creating this facility for Ferrari. This is at the end of '86. We were instilling new standards in Formula One then. That's when it came about, with the proper clean rooms and all the rest of it. Even up to then, I mean, lots of the monocoques we used at McLaren were built in the States by Hercules, who were a professional, outfit.
Sure.
With their carbon composite knowledge. But then we did bring them in-house at McLaren and make them in-house.
I mean, you designed some beautiful cars when you're at Ferrari. The 641 is in the MoMA collection in New York, for instance. How important is beauty in Formula One?
Well, very important to me. I mean, I do very much go by this ethos that if it looks right, it usually is right. And the other thing I try and do, which unfortunately lots of the paint schemes you get in Formula One cars masks, but I try and have a line that's flowing. I don't like lines which just stop. I mean, they have to flow, and they have to start and somewhere, and put it this way, they have to start and go to somewhere with a purpose, if you like. So it has to flow. And that's something I just like to see. I like to look at it. I can't. I've seen some cars where you got hideous noses and things that sort of are all bent and horrible. I mean, these cars today, I really don't like them. They're really quite ugly.
So after a brief stint at Benetton, you went back to Ferrari for a second bite at that particular cherry. You didn't get on with Michael Schumacher. Can we have a little talk about drivers? Prost seems to be a favourite of yours.
Well, yes. I mean, he, in terms of car setup and ability to distinguish, let's say, between a tyre problem and a chassis problem, I don't think anybody was as good as him.
Not so keen on De Cesaris.
I mean, he's a nice guy, but he got thrown in my opinion, far too early. He got thrown in because his, I don't know what he was, uncle or something, was the boss of Marlboro Europe, or Philip Morris, I should say, Europe. And Philip Morris was our number one sponsor at the time, big sponsor. And basically he was shoehorned into the second car because of that. And I think I think it didn't do him any favours because he was very young, very inexperienced, and was just driving outside himself half the time. As a person, I got on all right with him, fine. Yeah.
I mean, after the second time at Ferrari, you kind of consulted, I guess, is the best way of putting it, for Arrow, and then
theoretically consulted. I more or less went into Arrows as technical director,
right?
But it was kind of a consultancy because I had taken over the facilities from Ferrari that we created for Ferrari, taken them over and renamed them B3 Technologies. We then did a deal with Arrows where we would use all our facilities there to back up the team in Oxfordshire, and I would spend most of my week up in Oxfordshire. We running the drawing office. We moved the drawing office that we had at Guildford up to Leafield, where Arrows were, and so I was basing myself there pretty much all week. B3 continuing to make carbon composite stuff, fabrication stuff, machine stuff. For the team, so that was the kind of deal.
I mean, those later years seem quite frustrating. I don't know if that's true. You seem to be either fighting ingrained culture or lacking resources to do the job as you wanted to do it. Is that a fair comment?
It is to some degree. I mean, fighting ingrained cultures was something I got used to. For example, I walk into Ferrari, Piccinini, Enzo's right-hand man. He says to me one day, he said, "What did you do at McLaren for lunch times? What at the races, what did you do?" And I said, "Well, the boys would probably get a sandwich and a coffee, and they'd sort of 10 minutes, they'd sit down in the garage for 10 minutes and then get on with prepping the cars for qualifying or something like that." Ferrari used to lay the tables out, tablecloth, cutlery, quite often a bottle of Lambrusco or something on the table, and that was their lunchtime. And this is between practice and qualifying, and so Piccinini, who was a smart guy, he said, "What do you think then? Do you think we should? Do you think we should do that here? Do you think we should stop the lunchtime?" I said, "Well, quite honestly, Marco, I think that's, I don't know how they get the work done if you operate like that. Leave it to me." He said, "Leave it to me." So the next thing I know, Barnard stops the wine at lunchtime. Barnard stops, the table, the sit-down lunch and so on. It was all me. But in fact, it was Piccinini that went out there and said, "Mr. Barnard doesn't want this anymore. Mr. Barnard wants you to stop that." So, that's what you're dealing. I thought, oh, well, if he's going to use my name to get it done, that's fine. But of course, I get the backlash. I get the backlash from the people that don't want it to change. So I'm going through culture changes all the time.
I mean, this might sound like a daft question because you've had this extraordinary career, but do you think you fulfilled your potential? There are other designers out there who won more championships than you did.
Yeah.
Are there regrets? Do you wish occasionally you'd sat in?
I look back on it and I think, well, maybe I pushed the boat too far. Then maybe I should have just done a tweak, done a polish to the existing car and carried on. Maybe I admit to pushing technically too far, too fast.
So more recently, you've been making furniture out of carbon fibre with Terence Woodgate,
yes,
and with Established and Sons making it. How did that come about?
That came about because in 1995 I was elected into the RDI, the Royal Designers for Industry, which is a offshoot of the Royal Society of Arts, and it covers all design disciplines basically, and there's a limited number. There were 100 when I joined maximum, and I think it's up to 200 now. But basically, it's just a recognition by other designers, if you like, other well-known designers, so I became an RDI in '95. Terence Woodgate, a furniture designer, he became an RDI, or he was. I don't know whether he was an RDI before me or after me, I can't remember. But we met through the RDI, and Terence, we started talking, and Terence had these ideas, for, in this particular instance, a table. And I sat down and figured out how we could make it. And it's gone on from there, this kind of partnership, anything to do with carbon furniture, carbon composite furniture, we do as a partnership. I like it because it's the timescales are.
Presumably the pace is rather different.
Well, yeah, the timescales are kind of what you want, really. I'll do that next week. Which is just I'd never operated like that before. And to be honest, the engineering is relatively simple, although again, cost factors get to the top of the list now as much as anything. But it's good fun, and we're looking at some new things at the moment. We did this table that got quite good reviews, and it's quite, it's a very, very thin table.
Well, that first table you did is absolutely beautiful.
I mean, it was pretty amazing. And then I remember we upped the size all the way to a 6 metre long, 1.4 wide, which Johnny Ive, the Apple designer, has one. And that looks pretty amazing when you see that 6 metres long. And when you look at it from the side, it looks about 3 millimetres thick. Obviously, it's a bit thicker than that in the middle, but you don't notice that when you're standing up looking at it. And that looks pretty impressive when you see, a 6 metre, 3 millimetre thick sheet on 4 legs. But again, actually, that's a good illustration, because I sit down and I do hand calculations on the composite layup and how we're going to make it, etc. And there was a bit of an argument over this 6 metre table and about the sag or the droop that happened in the table. So I sat down and worked it out, and I think people were beginning to suspect my calculations. And so I said, all right, we'll get somebody to do an FE on it, a finite element on this table, which we did. And I worked it out and sat down and worked it out. And they did all this FE and run it through all these computers and everything else. And I think I said it was, I forget what it was sort of approximately 4 millimetres of sag in the middle. And they came up with sort of 3.99 or something like that. It was like so close, it wasn't even worth talking about. And I thought, yeah, okay, that's all right. I can still do it. I can still do the numbers.
So I can hear your grandchildren downstairs, and we ought to really let you go. So final question, are you designing other things at the moment? There was
Bit
talk
more
of a fold-up
furniture.
bike, I heard.
I did start on a bike, and that was a bit unfortunate because I got to the point where I was sort of ready to do a prototype, but it was one of those things that needs the input of electronics, of carbon composites, and machining and so on. And McLaren have all that. And at the time, I spoke to Ron Dennis, and Ron said, "I'll build you a prototype. Then we'll do it here. We'll do a prototype here." And then they had that terrible year with Honda, and then the next thing I know, he's gone. So I didn't get my prototype.
That's still on the drawing board.
It's still there. It's still sort of. I don't know whether it'll ever happen, but.
Well, John, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. The Perfect Car, the biography of John Barnard by Nick Skeens, is published by Evero and is available at all good bookshops. There are images from the interviews as well as little films and other things on my Instagram page, Grant on Design. If you've enjoyed listening and want to see this podcast flourish, then please rate and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to this from, and go to my Patreon page and make a pledge. You can find that at patreon.com/Material Matters. You'll be helping to take the message of the importance of materials, skill, craft and design to a whole new audience. Thanks very much for listening.